We are pleased to open our transparency series with sports journalist Andy Wittry. Using public records requests, Andy obtained two sets of documents that show the Power 5's Congressional Playbook to gain absolute control over college sports legal and regulatory environments. These are documents the Power 5 don't want the public to see. In our discussion, Andy explains the importance of the Power 5 documents and the use of public records requests as a tool to inform the public and hold public institutions accountable for their policy and decision making. Good morning, Andy, and welcome to the DYK podcast.
It's great to be here, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've really been looking forward to this discussion, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about some documents that you obtained through a couple of public records requests, one in 2020, one in 2023, to provide some really interesting insight into how the Power 5 sees their engagement with Congress and the role that they have in that engagement. But before we get to those documents, if you could provide for our listeners and viewers a little bit about your background, how you got into journalism.
I went to Indiana University, which is a great journalism school. The School of Journalism at the time was named after a war correspondent named Ernie Pyle. So I always had a background in traditional print journalism, kind of the ethics and true structure of journalism, right? Which the media landscape is changing a lot. I always knew I wanted to cover sports to some capacity. In high school, I had worked for my student newspaper. So I always knew this is something I really enjoy, something I was passionate about. And I think as you go further in this business and try to find what's my lane, right? What's my niche? What can I bring that's a unique voice or perspective or approach? And I think, frankly, I learned covering the Indiana men's basketball team is that that's probably one of the bigger media bases in the country. And when there's maybe 30 plus media people and reporters in a press conference at a time, and there's very limited media engagements, how do you stand out? And it's really tough. And at the time, I had learned how to do public records requests. Every state or most states have some form of public records law. Maybe it's open records or public records, that the name can vary. And so at the time, as a student reporter, you're looking for what is even the smallest news that I can break. And for me, that was non-conference game contracts, right? So is Indiana going to host Kennesaw State or Mississippi Valley State? What's the game guarantee, the financial payment to get this team to come to Bloomington, which is really, in the scheme of even the IU media sphere, what's the impact? Who really cares? They're going to announce that at some point, right? But that was really my intro to this world of public records requests, because as I was, getting started, my dad sent me a story one time from the AP, I think in 2015 or 2016, that said that the AP could have, which is ironic looking back now, essentially AI that would analyze the box score from a minor league baseball game and produce a game recap. And I think I was maybe, a junior at the time in college. And that wasn't scary or doom and gloom, but it was a reality that, if you're writing simple game stories based on who won and who lost, there are computers and artificial intelligence that can basically do that. They're going to miss some of the human component, and they can't, at this point, ask poignant questions. But as far as a basic game recap, a computer can do that. And so I found as a way to pivot and to create my own lane and what can I do differently to stand out, I found public records were a very useful tool in the toolbox, especially as someone who's, if you're in your low 20s and just trying to break through. I had 6 internships, and that might be a bigger number than most, but the idea of having multiple and having to work for a while to find your first full-time employment, I'm not sure that part is unique. And so I found that, public records are a really beneficial tool to make people that maybe they don't want to be your sources, may not even know they are your sources, become your sources because they are employees of a public school, and because they get taxpayer funding or government funding, they are now liable not just to reporters, but to citizens at large. Their documents are now susceptible to being requested. And so that's been a really valuable tool, especially, during the pandemic when people weren't really traveling or games were being played or there weren't in-person press conferences or, media days may not have happened in a traditional sense. There really a chance to network and really find your footing, especially for someone who, when I was in my mid-20s when the pandemic hit, it's like, all right, like what's next? When my day job at the time was covering sports for Warner Brothers Discovery's NCAA digital department. If there are no college sports, understandably, I was concerned, will there even be a staff to cover sports for NCAA.com, as a Warner Brothers Discovery employee? Like I wouldn't even blame them, right? If there's no sports, why do you have a staff covering sports for NCAA.com? And that's why I launched my own independent newsletter in the summer of 2020, in July of 2020. And it was just a side hobby, a side hustle. I'm like, you know what, if I have all this free time on my hands, and you know what, this pandemic thing might be around for a year or two or three,
Right.
let's find some way to work on professional development, building my brand as a reporter and a voice. And so I launched a Substack newsletter called Out of Bounds with Andy Wittry. It was once a week. Would usually publish on Fridays, if not, a different day of the week, if there were multiple editions in a single week. And it was really focused on, as the name might suggest, off the field and off the court storylines that affect college athletics. Because at that time, and we're still kind of in this time, it's changed a little bit as far as the health and safety stuff. But there's so much going on with the landscape of college athletics, from the NIL era to health and safety to employment status. And that was kind of my approach to covering college sports.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, Andy, is that so much of what's going on right now in the regulation of college sports, the future of college sports, is being done off the books by a very, very small groups of people. And I think most stakeholders don't understand that off the books campaign, particularly in Congress. And one of the things we're trying to do with DYK Media is to shine a little light on that. And, your work using public records requests goes to the heart of that. And, those documents, those public entity documents are the people's documents. And I think a lot of people don't understand that basic component of the relationship between governmental entities and the people they serve. Of course, in the business model in big time college sports, you have largely private entities at the voluntary regulatory level who are running college sports, like the NCAA, like the Power 5 conferences, all structured as education nonprofits. And of course, state laws exempt private entities. So you can only get public records from public entities. But when you started Out of Bounds, did you kind of see yourself as an investigative sports journalist? Or was that just one piece, the investigative piece, one piece of a broader approach to sports journalism?
I think that was one piece, especially, covering sports, when you intern at a newspaper, sometimes tongue in cheek, sometimes maybe a little bit as a derogatory comment. The sports desk might be called, the toy department, right? It's like, oh, well, this is just sports, right? And based on the model of newspapers, it might be the thing that's sustaining the whole enterprise, but also compared to City Hall or the courts and crime, it may not be as important to society at large, right? And I do think this was my chance, hopefully, to apply that journalism degree and apply that education of, I think there's a way that you can have a true journalistic approach, and not to say that others aren't, but to kind of to myself and to my own passion and interest of like, hey, like, let's take this seriously, because there's a lot going on right now, especially if you think back to the summer of 2020, where college sports is and where it's going. Is it sure, I don't want to overstate my investigative credentials, but I do think, once again, to go back to that tool in the toolbox metaphor, that is part of it and part of my approach.
I would just say the documents that you obtained, particularly the 2019 documents we're going to talk about here in a second, are very, very important in my judgment, because it provides insight into how these powerful decision makers were thinking about protecting the business model, protecting the regulatory and legal environment, and how they were going to go about doing that. These are heavy hitters. These are some of the biggest power players, not just in college sports, but in higher education. And you had the aggregation of power with the Power 5 conferences, and in my judgment, really breathtaking and very important. So let's talk a little bit, before we get into the 2019 documents, how would you describe the nature of your journalism now, and does the investigative piece of it fit into what you're currently doing?
Certainly. I think the ACC memo that we'll discuss shortly, I think that's part of my job and part of kind of the breadth of what I do. My role, my official title is NIL/sports business reporter, which, right now that's such an all-encompassing title, right? The field of sports business, and even, the industry of NIL. I was telling someone this morning that I think it can kind of get oversimplified and watered down to those three letters of NIL.
Right.
Or even, your relative that may not follow sports or even care about sports. There's a pretty good chance that they've heard about NIL based on the nightly news, right? Whatever the face of NIL, whatever athlete, whether it's a quarterback or it's a gymnast or a basketball player, whomever, they've probably seen the light 2-minute feature piece on TV. But
Right.
in the weeds, NIL can include so much, right? From state legislation to will there be a federal bill that is passed, to the educational component, to what the heck are the latest NIL collectives doing? And so I think all of that, NIL is one subset within sports business. But when it comes
Hmm.
to media rights and conference realignments, and once again, the looming player employment or athlete employment question, there's a lot to that. And I do think at times, especially as you look at, as you mentioned, the way that there's a very select group of people making decisions, and it's hard to maybe to crack that nut, to crack that
Yes.
shell and learn stuff from what's going on in those rooms or on those Zoom meetings now in 2023, is that it might require some investigative piece.
Right.
And it's a very low barrier to entry, right? With public records of, what, John or Jane Doe, someone who's just a citizen can do this, let alone a reporter. But I think it's a tool that often goes underutilized.
You used the metaphor cracking the nut. I've used the metaphor in my other podcast, The Big Amateurs and Monologues, of breaking the code. And when you spend a lot of time deep in the weeds in these legal issues, the regulatory issues, the campaign in Congress, and I've been very deep in all three of those, I start to see patterns. And when I see a news story, I see who is quoted in that news story. I know where that piece of the puzzle fits in the broader mosaic of the interest. And you develop kind of an instinct for that. And it sounds like you have developed an instinct through your public records work when you're looking at some of these issues that pop up and become part of the public narrative, often for a very short time. When you look at those things, are you thinking, I see a public records angle? I'm not asking you to give away your state secrets, but just whether you feel like you've developed that instinct.
Absolutely. I do have that lens. And it's not to say that I'm the best at it or perfect at it, but I do think a lot of times when you see the finely crafted, very intentional press release or announcement, or the way that
Yes.
something is phrased, you can kind of see behind the scenes that, what, something went into this. Maybe it's
Right.
not Watergate and some deep state scandal, but there might be more to the story that isn't being reported or people don't want to share. And once again, getting back to, these are often public schools involved. There's a very clear lane to find out, or at least try to find out, what went into this. And that's a great use of public records.
So let's talk a little bit about the 2019 documents that you got. And you wrote an article about those documents when you were working through your own website, Out of Bounds. And you wrote an article, and this was dated November 10th of 2020. Power 5 document. We don't think Mark Emmert or the NCAA should be taking the lead in Washington. And then you describe and then attach to that article the actual documents that you got. If you could talk a little bit about just kind of a broad characterization of those documents, and if you are comfortable saying, what led you to kind of say, wait a minute, there's something here that we need to take a look at.
I went back this morning, Richard, and looked at, okay, why the heck I make so many of these. And this was back from 2019. And I think that the original request, it was to Ohio State. At their time, their president was a man named Michael Drake. He's now the president of the whole University of California system. So he has since moved on. The person that wrote the meeting notes here, was Larry Scott, the former Pac-12 commissioner. I think the email that the exchange may have been between Michael Drake and former Big Ten commissioner Jim Delaney. So everyone involved here has since changed roles. And I think this was maybe a month or two after the state of California had passed what was colloquially known as the Fair Pay to Play Act. They were the very first state, California was, whose lawmakers had passed a state law regarding NIL rights. And this was a landmark moment. This was back in 2019. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the original date was not July 1st, 2021, which became kind of the official start of the NCAA's NIL era. I think it may have been in 2023. Forgive me if that date is not correct, but I know the initial date was not July of 2021. And
for the California bill?
Yes, the Senate Bill 206.
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the reasons that they set that date in the preamble to that legislation, it said that they explicitly were pushing the date, 4 years out, because this was in 2019, to give the NCAA time to change its own rules, which they haven't done. And a lot of people think this interim policy is a rules change. It is not. And they still haven't changed a word of bylaw 12.5. But so
at the time, this was, that California was the first state. And I think that I was just looking for how are people reacting, right? This is at the time, I don't think it actually probably got the play it deserved, giving
Right.
those folks like the Nancy Skinners and the Andy Schwartzes and everyone
Hmm.
involved in that effort. Because
Hmm.
once again, this whole beat of NIL and sports business, I know it's kind of a niche subject that has now gone mainstream because of how it might impact, football recruiting and mainstream college football, college basketball. But in its core, at its foundation, this is, state bills. Like who reads those for fun or in their free time? I do now because it's my job and I enjoy it, but I know that it's an in the weeds niche
Right.
subject. And so I was just curious, I think looking back at this request, was how are leaders reacting? And obviously, I'm from Cincinnati, so Ohio State is a big school nationally, especially given, my upbringing. My grandparents are diehard Buckeyes fans, didn't go there, right? Like many Ohio State fans or many, big state U fans didn't actually go to the school, but it's a big part of your social life in your circle. And Ohio State is, annually, it's probably one of the two schools that reports the greatest amount of athletic department revenue. So my thought was,
Right.
let's go to Ohio State and how are they reacting to kind of this whole notion of NIL legislation, right? And ironically, Ohio State is one school where they actually almost don't let you be too specific with your records request, which I find interesting. I think they do it because they think it's an advantage. Where many schools, you can't really file a request unless you are specific regarding, let's say, if you're looking for emails, that you'd have to say who might the sender or recipient be. Maybe sometimes both. I need to name both the sender and recipient, maybe even list
Interesting.
their email addresses. You might need a certain date range or keywords. So most schools say, you know what, you have to give us almost every specific, maybe not, don't name the email, but kind of everything around the email. Ohio State's actually different, and you can't be too specific. You just have to say kind of like generally, here's what I want, which is kind of it. It might be unique, like by the literal definition of unique. I don't know if I've experienced another school that does that in their records. And it may have helped me in this case. I don't know, because it may have actually expanded my search radius based on, I didn't know this document existed, but I got it back. And it included this Power Five, or as the official designation goes, Autonomy 5 strategy call, which once again, the notes were drafted by Larry Scott, the former Pac-12 commissioner. And it was before a meeting that was going to take place in December of 2019. And really, it outlined their strategy, which was, we need to take charge as the Power Five on Capitol Hill with what a federal bill might look like. But we can't threaten or sideline the NCAA. We don't think that they, or now former President Mark Emmert, has the sway or standing to accomplish what we want, but we can't brand this as a Power Five effort. That was sort of the gist of, we have the most at stake. We might have better relationships compared to the NCAA at large, which is so diverse among, I think roughly 1,100 member institutions and something like roughly 100 conferences across 3 divisions. And so they were saying, we should take charge. Here is our messaging. Here's what we want. And then at some point, we will sit down, Mark Emmert and the folks in Indianapolis, and then explain to them, here's how this will work. Here's what we want. In almost, I don't know if patronizing is the right word, but, technically he oversees the whole association. And they're saying, actually, we're going to lead this effort. And at some point, we will loop in Mark Emmert and sit him down and explain to him. But, they named him, they named the NCAA. There was a reference to the quote unquote blue disc, the NCAA logo,
Right.
saying that
Right.
doesn't have a good reputation among members of Congress. And this is why we're going to lead this. And then at some point, kind of tell the leaders of the NCAA, including Emmert, here's what we're going to do.
And so, the timeline's always important when you're looking at public records requests and your instinct is engaged. Do you have kind of a sense of the relevance of the timeline? I'm a big believer in looking at the timeline and looking at the other things that are happening or have happened, and not looking at one event in isolation. Do you think about it on those terms?
I think you have to. So, for example, one thing that
Yeah.
really stands out with that question, Richard, this is Big Ten Commissioner Jim Delaney, who at the time was still
Mhm.
Big Ten Commissioner, before Kevin Warren's tenure. And he had wrote in an email, I believe this was to Michael Drake, at the time Ohio State president. He wrote, quote, "I've been under impression that NCAA is contemplating litigation v. states on an interstate commerce basis, but I don't know
Right.
that for sure." To get back to your point, at this point, I believe California, once again, we know was the first, I believe at the time was the only state that had officially passed a bill regarding what we now know is, sort of NIL law or NIL legislation, however you want to frame that. When it's just California, which we know is a very blue state, the way that California operates may not be similar to the rest of the states in the country in many aspects, and especially compare and contrast. Okay, well, how does a California bill at this time, once again, getting back to this larger sequence, larger timeline that you referenced, Richard, how does California passing a bill in the early fall of 2019, how will that be received in Florida or Georgia or the Southeast, where a lot of the power of college athletics lies? How will it be handled in Ohio, which spiritually might be similar to some of those states, right? Not only for the way that Ohio State operates as far as their revenue and success of football, but also maybe it can be a swing state, right? So maybe kind of in between for what is California and what is maybe parts of the Southeast. So at that point, you could maybe make the case, is California an outlier? And if no other state follows, would the NCAA think that its best strategy is to try to sue the state of California to prevent this from happening? And if it's one and only, maybe you win that. But then when Florida follows and other states follow, at that point, the NCAA, it's behind the eight ball because it's numerous states across the political spectrum that have now passed these bills.
Yeah, and so when I saw these documents, I was looking at what had happened just in the prior 6 months, and of course, you had the Mark Walker bill in March of 2019, which would have altered the NCAA's tax status and tax exemption unless they provided name, image, and likeness rights. Then in May, you had the NCAA forming the federal and state legislation working group, which turned out to be, initially, they were looking at whether they should continue their opposition to name, image, and likeness. Because remember, we're just on the backside of O'Bannon. And the O'Bannon attorney's fees litigation went into June of 2018. I'm sorry, June of 2018. And the NCAA was militantly opposed to name, image, and likeness. They just spent $140 million in O'Bannon to prevent that market from coming into existence. So the NCAA used that working group to kind of take over the messaging, to kind of take control of the narrative. And then you're rolling into the California law, and people forget, that to that Delaney email, that Mark Emmert wrote a letter to Gavin Newsom, governor of California, threatening Commerce Clause litigation. And in the Austin litigation, in an argument in the Ninth Circuit, Seth Waxman, the lawyer for the NCAA, raised that possibility again. So you have all that context coming into this 2019 meeting in December. And then another thing that we learned in April 2020, when this working group publishes its final report, is that in November of 2019, before this Power 5 meeting, the NCAA formed a special subcommittee, the Presidential Subcommittee on Congressional Action, under the working group's label, and they were dedicated to finding ways to eliminate the nil market through protective federal legislation. So when you look back now at that December 2019 meeting, it has even more significance, I think, as the congressional campaign played out. And could you talk a little bit, when you saw there were 15 people who attended that meeting on December 10th, or were part of the teleconference. When you saw that list, what was your initial reaction to it?
It's all of them. This is all the heavy hitters. It's every P5 commissioner at the time.
Yeah.
You have the Syracuse chancellor. You have the NC State AD. You have every commissioner, and then Georgia's president, who's on several committees, Jerry Moorhead. You have all these people, Ohio State's president, as we've established.
Right.
Like this is the group. And it's not exclusive. There are important folks outside of this group. But especially at the time, you think about some of the standing that these folks have, like a Jim Delaney that ran the Big Ten for as long as he did and oversaw the creation of the Big Ten Network. And we see the role now that, TV rights and conference networks can play. This is like everyone. And, this is pre-pandemic, but this really shows you who is making these decisions. And this is something I know that we've talked about previously, Richard, is that so much of this is involving and inherent to the athletes themselves. But obviously there's not athletes that are on these specific Zoom calls, right? There might be student athlete advisory committees. There might be health and safety working groups or mental health working groups, where there is an athlete rep. But a call like this, where it's, hey, how do we approach Congress? how do we eventually sit down with Mark Emmert and explain to him our strategy? It's not like you have, two quarterbacks, a couple gymnasts, and a baseball player, right? This is the P5 commissioners and a handful of really important presidents or chancellors and ADs.
When I first saw this list, I first noted that they're all men. All right. They make a reference to, protecting Title IX. I just thought the irony of that was really interesting. And 12 of the 15 are white. So you have basically, this is the smoke-filled Zoom room, where you have the future of college sports being decided by a very small group of people, the most powerful decision makers behind the scenes. And you have 15 men, 12 white men. And what comes out of that meeting, I think, is a little disingenuous, because they're saying, we want to be the owners of this congressional engagement, but we don't want anybody to know that we're the owners. We don't want this labeled as a Power Five movement. But, when you look at this list, you mentioned that there are no athletes. Of course, there aren't any athletes, because the athlete voice is irrelevant. But you also don't have Mark Emmert, obviously. And you don't have Donald Remy, who was the chief legal guy and was kind of the strategist on campaigns in federal courts and also in Congress. And this is a really interesting dynamic. And could you talk a little bit about concerns that they raised about Mark Emmert?
They basically just flat out said it. They said that he doesn't have the reputation or standing, as I scroll here, look for this specific wording, but they were taking this out of Mark Emmert's hands as the president of the NCAA and saying, no, this is us. This is, like you mentioned, this is the Jim Delaney's, the Greg Sankeys. We're the ones here making the call. Right. There's one bullet point I just found, quote, but notably, we don't think Mark or the NCAA should be taking the lead in Washington. There are a couple of reasons we believe this. First, the feedback we hear in Washington is that the NCAA does not have a good reputation with senators or members of Congress. Second, the presidents and our government affairs leaders at our 65 universities have ongoing working relationships with the senators and members of Congress. Later on, it says, but we don't want the NCAA to feel threatened or sidelined. Right. This will require diplomatic discussions, and at some point, this will require a group of presidents and commissioners sitting down with Mark. We as commissioners have had some initial conversations with Mark, but really believe it will be the voices of our presidents and commissioners collectively aligned that will be required.
So when you read that, when you were taking it in and preparing your article, did you think about framing it in terms of how disingenuous the Power Five were being about their interest and the extent of their involvement by not putting the congressional campaign label on their own chest? They wanted it on the NCAA's chest, but they were calling the shots. Did that aspect of the memo resonate with you?
I think it did. The way that I titled this newsletter was Power Five document, colon, and then it's the quote, we don't think Mark or the NCAA should be taking the lead in Washington. But yeah, that was how I titled it. This is notable that this is the P5 saying this is not Mark Emmert, this is not the NCAA, this is us. And then once you get inside the story, like you mentioned, it's still, and this is not maybe unique to this specific strategy and approach. We might see it with football, the way that maybe there's ways that, legally the NCAA still covers a sport that it's not technically running the championship of. And this is kind of similar where, hey, we still want some of the perks of the NCAA. We want this maybe branding and labeled where we're not maybe taking the backlash, or when there are legal fees, it's not only us, but we're going to be the ones kind of maybe the puppet master, right? We're the one that's running the show here.
Right. And to that point, and this is such an important point, and that is that none of the Power Five football money goes to the NCAA because of Board of Regents, the 1984 Supreme Court decision, which gave football their financial freedom from the NCAA. They still operate under the NCAA umbrella, but all these expenses, lobbying, lawyers, public relations, they're paid out of NCAA funds, and the NCAA's sole source of revenue for all intents and purposes is March Madness. So the Power Five have kind of gotten a free ride, and some advocacy groups have talked about that a little bit. I want to read another quote that I think is very, very important. They say this: these are the relationships that matter, and they're talking about the Power Five conference and the schools in the Power Five, their relationships directly with their representatives in Congress. These are the relationships that matter. And the members and senators care about their state universities and what they bring to their states and constituents much more than they care about our national trade association. Calling out the NCAA as a trade association was spot on. But what's important about that, and when you look at the evolution of the NCAA Power 5 campaign in Congress, is that the Power 5 have now dispensed with hiding behind the NCAA. They're going straight to Congress. They're going directly from institutional interests to state interests to the senators and representatives who serve those interests. And it is a direct appeal to the power mostly of big-time football in the big-time football states. When you read that, how did that land with you? They characterized the NCAA as a trade association and that they believed that they had a direct pipeline outside of the NCAA.
I wouldn't say it's saying the quiet part out loud. I think it's just the part that people overlook. There's a reason that when you say NCAA rules versus state laws, you say laws for one and rules for the other, right? This is an association. And it's a reason that people kind of conflate, oh, the big bad NCAA. Well, guess what? A lot of that, it's the schools themselves, right? It's the presidents and chancellors and the folks in meetings and on calls like the one that we're talking about, Richard. So once again, it's not saying the quiet part out loud, but it's making that distinction to their advantage because, hey, if we're a trade association, we might have bigger or more financially tied interests than some of our other constituents in this trade association that are at the D3 level, right? Or the lower Division I level. And I think you're really smart to point out how they observed Congress at the time. There's another line that I found. This is part of the email thread, not from this memo, but still part of this larger, document dump that really stood out to me. And this is, I believe, now former Maryland President Wallace Lowe. He wrote, and I believe this is to Michael Drake and Jim Delaney, the former Big Ten commissioner. And he wrote, quote, "Ideally, I agree that any proposed legislation should stay narrow and focused. But this is a political judgment that should take into account the current, quote, woke climate, at least among Democratic members in the House of Representatives," and then in parentheses, "and in state legislators controlled by a Democratic majority." And that's where, he put woke in quotes. So it's maybe his observation of how maybe his constituents or people around him view the climate. But once again, getting back to our point of this is a meeting of, I believe you said it was 15 men. I think 12 of them were white men. And looking at the kind of the state of government nationally, right? About how the current makeup of Congress might be more challenging to their interests. And I think as we touch on the ACC memo later, they referenced largely maybe some similar dynamics about, hey, if it's a Republican controlled Congress in both houses, this might be better for us. And I do think you're right that when they look at maybe the importance of a narrow and, as they say, focused bill, this may be purely NIL, or as they would hope and they wish is only NIL, and maybe not touch on employment status or all these additional aspects, media rights. Is that, that might be the achievable path as they pitch this to their local representatives as, hey, your local constituents who, if these are college towns and college markets where that kind of runs the state, that kind of run during football season from late August through, maybe now January and growing. That's from Tuesday or Wednesday on in these towns. This all revolves around the game, around Saturday, right? And if there's a threat to those markets, and you always see the stats about how much in commerce and revenue a home game might bring, right, to a Power 5 community, for the hotels and the bars and the restaurants and Uber and all these different industries, whether it's accurate or not, they could maybe frame this as, if making athletes employees or doing these things that we don't want affects your constituents and affects local commerce and affects these constituents and stakeholders, that's big bad, and we can't have that. And I'm not saying it's wrong. To some degree, there might be some truth in that, but that might be the pitch, especially if the makeup of Congress changes going forward at the next, congressional election or elections, plural. That might be the way that they can pass something. I agree with you that I don't think that I wouldn't say there's a 0% chance that Congress passes some NIL related or NIL adjacent bill. Now, it might take Congress changing. It might take the messaging, as we've called it, right? The messaging, as a Power 5 has called it, to hone in on here's what works for especially the P5, but maybe is also suitable to the NCAA at large, because everyone now knows that the P5 is doing this. We've seen that the American Athletic Conference and its commissioner, Mike Oresco, based on the reporting that I had last week with that ACC memo, that kind of put that conference over the edge a little bit, because they're like, hey, we think that we're closer to the ACC and Pac-12 than the Big Ten and ACC might be. So why aren't we in this mix? Why don't we have a say? Once those parties, maybe not, if and when they ever get on the same page and Congress maybe changes in their favor, that might be the path when they can sell, this is going to ruin local commerce and your local constituents are unhappy. That might be the pathway to passing a narrow federal bill.
Yeah, and that the narrowness of that bill is so important. That's been one of the dynamics that's played out in the debate, beginning really in February 2020 with the first hearing in Senate Commerce. And of course, Commerce is so important because they have original jurisdiction over sports-related issues. They also would be the committee that would grant preemption. There have been hearings in 3 Senate committees: Commerce, Judiciary, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Why those 3 committees? Because the NCAA wants preemption of state laws to take states out of the regulatory field. They want antitrust immunity that comes from Judiciary, and that's the relevant committee. And Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, I'll give you a hint. It's not about health, education, or pensions. It's about labor and the no employee provision, or amending federal labor laws to exclude athletes as employees. That's where you get it. And they have been very focused on keeping this tight. They don't want to talk about the other interests, health and safety, or revenue sharing, or athlete voice, or who gets to decide what the future of college sports looks like. So could we transition now? So let's press fast forward to 2023. We've had all these hearings and we've had these bills introduced. And that very first bill that came in June of 2020 was from Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, SEC. And that bill gives the NCAA everything it wants: preemptions, antitrust immunity, athletes can't be employees, offers virtually nothing in terms of name, image, and likeness benefits. And so nil was the shiny object, but the real purpose was to gain absolute regulatory control so they could do whatever the heck they wanted to in the market on nil or anything else. But then we transitioned. We had the Democrats taking control of the Senate after the Georgia special elections. And then a lot of people in the NCAA, including, I think, thought that the Republicans were going to get the Senate in the last midterm election cycle. They didn't get that. And this ACC memo was dated December 13th. And the fact that that's post-midterm, I think, is significant. Could you talk a little bit about, again, I'm not asking for sources and methods or your instincts, but you get these documents. Could you talk a little bit about the document, what was in it, and then how you saw it fitting into the documents that you got in 2019?
Right. And there is kind of some irony in timing, right? If this is now 3 years later after the memo we just discussed, and this is now present day, right? And as you mentioned, fast forward about the way that Congress has changed, the way that these federal bills have been proposed, the way that state NIL legislation is now pretty prolific, right? Like roughly 30 or so states. And this is now present day. So this is a look at, okay, well, what's next? Like in many ways, a lot has changed, as we know, Richard. In other ways, they're still fighting the same fight, maybe from a different angle. And this was a memo that, and you know what, ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips has said this, so I'm not saying stuff that isn't already out there. In all caps fonts, it says confidential, attorney-client privilege. It says privilege and confidential. Someone in the chain of command made a mistake. It's like when you play Monopoly, and I think it's the chance card, right? Where it's like the bank has made an error in your favor, collect $200. That's sort of what happened here, right? Jim Phillips kind of alluded to it. That's already out there. That's what happened. This memo was written by an attorney in North Carolina. His name is John Barrett of Barrett Law. He worked for, I think it was 13 years with the Big Ten Conference during the tenure of Jim Delaney. He oversaw, or Barrett was part of the Big Ten team, or the outside help, during the launch of the Big Ten Network, during conference expansion. So just to give the background of who this guy is, and once again, that's a different conference, right? Power 5's are working together. He has, institutional knowledge with a P5 conference, with the Big Ten. We know some of the ties between Jim Delaney and maybe the ACC based on his backgrounds at the State and University of North Carolina. So just some greater kind of networks and how we try to tie this all together for the listeners here, Richard. And this was, this was branded, as we reported, right, as an ACC memo. Technically, it is a outside law firm that was working with the conference. So I want to make that distinction. But it was sent, to reps of every single ACC member school that I obtained. And this was their approach to how do we approach Congress. And so this is both addressing the ACC's specific approach regarding federal legislation, but it also referenced and alluded to what was called kind of a Power Five consensus. So showing that once again, these conferences are working together. They have reportedly, based on this memo, agreed on certain subjects and topics. But this is also a look that then, okay, as the ACC internally huddles, what do we agree on to then take back to this larger group that we're all working together with? And there are what this memo terms as 5 must-haves. And those 5 must-haves that were established by what this memo calls working teams from the Power 5, they have, reportedly reached a consensus according to the memo. And those 5 things are: no employee status of student athletes, no student athlete NIL rights and media telecasts of games, no NIL or other third-party payments as recruiting or participating inducements. Federal legislation on these topics will preempt state laws. We mentioned preemption already in our discussion, Richard. And the 5th and final one must have legal liability protection for following these provisions of the new law, at least prospectively.
Which is antitrust immunity, right? So those 3 death provisions are front and center as must-haves. Then we have the other kind of nil-related issues. And on this notion of who had a seat at the table in formulating this consensus, each conference had a 4-member working group that was dedicated to providing input and formulating policy. And that was part of the consensus. So you had these 4 people at each of the 5 power conferences. And I just want to point out who they were. I think that's really important. You had the Power 5 conference commissioners. You had the Power 5 conference staff member responsible for governance. You had the lawyers, legal counsel, and then you had the quote unquote government relations consultant, which means lobbyist. So you have the lawyers, the lobbyists, the Power 5 conference commissioners, and a staff member. And I thought that was just breathtaking. You don't have university presidents and chancellors. They're not at the primary decision-making table here. They're kind of in the background. And of course, you have no athlete representation, none. And I think that's a really important transition from 2019 to 2023 in terms of who had a seat at the table. And everybody's going to agree on these 3 death provisions because it preserves the status quo. There's not going to be a person sitting at any of those tables. It's going to say, wait a minute, we need to have an athlete sitting here. We absolutely need our university presidents and chancellors. We need to make sure, because we're talking about a structural change in the marketplace that will forever impair the athletes' interests. And if we get a bill from Congress, it's over. The athletes' rights movement is over. There's no discussion about the athlete voice. And when you got those documents and you looked at who was making those decisions, did you compare that to kind of what the environment was in 2019?
I certainly did. And I think that the one that really stands out is the government relations consultant. And not that we didn't know they exist. We know they do. You scroll through any sort of staff directory for a school, you read enough, you stay in tune, but you rarely, and there weren't names listed as to how, this is who these people are for each conference, but even kind of the reference to the type of person.
Right.
These aren't folks that make headlines where, we see a lot of profiles in today's media landscape of conference commissioners, right? It's almost, I kind of compare it to the way that Moneyball made the position of GM sexy for pro sports of, the wonks and the stat heads and how you build rosters. And there's this new avenue to sports interest where it's almost more so about the people behind desks and laptops. They're kind of now heroes or stars, which is kind of weird in some aspects. And I think at the college level, conference commissioners have sort of become that. Maybe ADs, where it's similarly, it's not the athletes, but there might be the long profile about the rise or the upbringing of a conference commissioner. Which not to say that they don't have interesting stories to tell or they don't deserve that coverage, but it's a similar kind of shift of the way that the sports landscape has been discussed. And so, you expect, okay, conference commissioners and the Greg Sankeys of the world, they'll be involved in those discussions. But now it's, this small group, like we've mentioned, it's now going to include a government relations consultant but not a school president, not an AD, not the Michael
Right.
Drakes or the Jerry Moorheads or whomever, but it's going to be the people in charge of both conference governance, as we mentioned, kind of the trade association type governance.
And the NCAA, they've had Brownstein Hyatt, the number one ranked lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., working for them since 2014. And when the Power Five started hiring lobbyists in 2019, 2020, it's a who's who of the top lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. It is breathtaking, the amount of firepower that they're bringing to this. And they use the term government relations consultant. They don't want to say the word lobbyist out loud. And there's been very little discussion about the true nature and extent and purpose of the lobbying campaign. That's one of the things that we're going to emphasize with DYK. There are a couple of other notable points about that memo. They said they wanted to start their engagement in the House rather than the Senate. And in 2020, almost everything ran through the Senate. What was your take on that when you saw that shift in emphasis in Congress?
I think it reaffirms some of the points that we've discussed, where the midterm elections may have not gone the way that not just conference commissioners and our government relations consultants and people that ilk expected, but maybe nationally, right? A lot of sharp pundits and people that do this for a living were wrong or maybe overstated this, the so-called red wave or how those midterms might go. And so as we look at, once again, stepping back to what was the emphasis in 2019? What is it now? What has it been the last, 3-5 years and going forward? Is that they might think that the Republican side of the party of government, that might be the side friendlier to their interests. And so they see that as, because the Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party, that we might go to the House first, have maybe more luck there, start there, maybe try to get a win or two, and then move on from that approach. So I think it tells a lot about, once again, like this isn't maybe flashy. This isn't even super public necessarily, but now when you kind of pull back the curtain, this is kind of the future of college sports, in a 4 or 5 page document, right? And it might have ripple effects that soon will hit college football recruiting and recruiting rankings and the men's basketball transfer portal and the College World Series and all these other things that may eventually become mainstream. But this is sort of how the sausage gets made and where all that funding, when we look at the lobbyists, the legal fees, all this kind of stuff, like this is where a lot of that money's going, and you don't see it. You may not hear about it, but this is why when you mention, the O'Bannon case and the way that the NCAA tried to share and maybe put some of the legal burden or the financial burden from the legal fees from Alston back on a lot of the schools versus just the Indianapolis portion of the revenue, but the national association's revenue, like this is all part of that same discussion about where the money goes and why.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, and I'm going to talk a little bit here to close this out about kind of how you see this work fitting into the current environment in sports journalism. I think what you got in these two requests, these are among the most important documents in this whole discussion about the future of college sports, going back to 2019 when the NCAA engaged Congress. The NCAA went to Congress. The Congress didn't come to the NCAA and the Power Five. This was a calculated campaign run through the best lobbying firm on the planet. The Power Five were piggybacking off of that, and they got their own lobbyists. But this was a calculated strategy to eliminate any legal or regulatory pathway that athletes might have to challenge the status quo business model. This is important stuff. But back to that ACC memo, they mentioned that the type of legislation they envision is going to be modeled after the Roger Wicker bill. And of course, Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi, introduced a bill in 2020 that I think it was a train wreck. That if I were ranking the bills that have been proposed from the worst to the least worst, Wicker would be the worst, the Wicker bill. And then he re-released that in 2022, and it provides the 3 death provisions. It also has retroactive antitrust immunity as to name, image, and likeness, which would theoretically capture this House litigation in California, class action name, image, and likeness litigation. But the other thing you point out, this is just, I think, says it all. The communications are supposed to run through Jim Phillips, who is the ACC commissioner. And they say you should communicate with Phillips by phone, but not text or email. I mean, when you saw that, what was your emotional response to that?
I knew I had the kicker to my story. This is accident that reveals what the Power Five strategy is. And it's something that without this, we could have certain guesses, right? A lot of this stuff
Right.
isn't new per se, but to have it in writing from once
Yes.
again, like I mentioned, who this attorney is, someone that helped with the creation of the Big Ten Network and the addition of new member schools to the conference. Like when we take a step back and evaluate the landscape, there may be more folks like this than we realize. That, not to say that there's once again some like, evil puppet master that's controlling conference realignment and trying to break up certain conferences or move certain schools, but there are folks that are very informed that, they don't get the glowing profile treatment in publications, but might have serious intel, serious knowledge, serious sway. And
Right.
John Barrett might be one of those folks. And we got this
Yeah.
from him and saw, okay, this is what the P5 is going to do or try to do on Capitol Hill. And here's why. And once again, when you see the roster, maybe not names this time like in 2019, but at least titles and descriptions, this is who is making this call.
Right.
No athletes, as you mentioned, there aren't presidents and ADs in those working groups. Now, surely they were consulted, right, for maybe feedback or input, but in these groups making kind of the last step before the working groups come together, there's no president, there's no AD. Forget the athlete, right? They weren't there in 2019. Why would they now be here in 2023 for the P5? But this shows it all. Like, this is kind of the playbook. This is, and not maybe literally this memo, but this larger story. Like, this is the story of college sports in 2023 and beyond. Like when I press publish, Richard, I was visiting family and my dad was in the room, and I couldn't form a sentence because that was like the journalist high of just like the endorphins of like, I think this is a pretty big freaking deal, right?
It is.
And it's
Yes.
when you watch a movie like Spotlight, not to compare that, but it's just kind of want to get back to my background of like, I went to journalism school and had internships at newspapers. Like, this is kind of that investigative, true journalism side. And I realized like, hey, this is something that I'm not sure we're supposed to have. And I think this might benefit the public and stakeholders a lot. So I appreciate the kind words about this reporting.
Yeah. And, that suggestion, if not a directive, don't communicate with Phillips by text or email. I took that as a clear intent to operate outside of public records documents and to try to keep this conversation in a format that would not be subject to public records requests. And I think that alone should be a front page story. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and all these big, even outside of the sports context, that should be a headline on the front page. And ESPN didn't cover it. The Athletic didn't cover it. Sports Illustrated, I don't know if anybody mentioned it there, but there hasn't been any meaningful coverage of what you have uncovered. And I wanted just to kind of close this out by transitioning to that issue. And I felt that way about the work you did to get those 2019 memos. This is like the blueprint. This is the secret playbook. You want the NCAA Power 5 playbook or the Power 5 playbook. Here it is. We don't have to speculate about their motives. We don't have to speculate about what they want. We don't have to speculate about who has a seat at the table. It's right here in black and white. And this raises some profound issues about the fairness of this business model and the injustice in it for the athletes whose rights are going to be limited by the very legislation they're discussing, but don't have a seat at the table. What's your take on why these documents and your work haven't been highlighted in the mainstream media?
I think the irony, Richard, is that the next day after we published this was new NCAA President Charlie Baker's first day on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's indicative of one of two theories, because the day that he started, I think I counted at least 6 different prominent outlets had an exclusive interview. And I say exclusive because he did one-on-ones with like 6 different outlets, right? So it wasn't a bulk session, but they all got their 30 minutes and was very, and this isn't even like a slight or negative, but very orchestrated, right? If we're going to give him time with these prominent outlets, get him some press, hopefully some positive coverage. So I saw the Associated Press, I saw The Athletic, I saw Sports Illustrated, Sportico, and I mentioned 6. So there's, maybe 2 or 3 more that I'm forgetting or missing.
Right.
And so I think a lot of those maybe happened Monday. I think that we press publish on the story on Tuesday. He started Wednesday. So there's a chance that because of the embargoed exclusives, that maybe they were all literally busy working. Maybe they were doing those interviews or working on those stories. Or the other side of that coin is because they are the outlets that would get those kind of stories. And this isn't, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, because those are all well-respected, phenomenal outlets. But is there
Right.
also a chance that because you are the type of outlet or reporter at those outlets that might get that type of exclusive and embargoed interview, which, like, I'll be honest, I wish that we got that. I've reached out for a chance to informally meet Charlie Baker, and frankly haven't heard back. So that's not even a judgment. I wish that I could maybe reach a status that they would want to give me that time with them, because I haven't even heard back yet. But you wonder if, because is there a, I hate to say coziness, but is there a level of relationship that because you do get that access, does that somehow remove the incentive to report on certain aspects of the strategy? And the other irony too is that this is once again the P5 saying, we're taking charge. This isn't even NCAA. So that
Right.
like the NCAA might be offended by this document, and they might actually appreciate additional reporting. So that's the timing I found interesting, given that there might be very logical explanations of they were covering the new NCAA commissioner, right? I think he's only the 6th one ever. So this is a big deal, right? But is the other side of that, okay, if they weren't so busy doing that, is it because there is a level of relationship, that there is a bit of friendliness, coziness, horse trading? And that's, I
Yes.
speaking broadly and hypothetically, not for any specific
Right. Right.
outlet or reporter. But as you mentioned, only because we had, our previous conversations, Richard, I went back to see who may have shared our reporting, just out of curiosity of who did cover this. And I saw a quote tweet, actually, I think 2 quote tweets from Sportico's Daniel Libet, who's someone that I
Hmm.
know. He's a huge proponent and
Right.
user of public records requests, someone who, maybe operates very similarly at times to I. And then I
Right.
saw Dan Wolken of USA Today also quote tweeted it. But as far as kind
Yeah.
of the traditional college sports media, a lot of those names were missing.
Right.
I heard from a few privately, I'll say that, but I don't know, as far as, was there more that they could have added, or context, or might they have people on speed dial that I don't know,
Right.
because I can't even hear back right when I reach out. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of big picture questions that, and I hate when people frame it as, oh, like I'm just asking questions, but I'm truly, I don't know the answers to it. So it might be a little bit unfair to speculate, but I did
Yeah.
think that maybe the silence, from some corners, I did find interesting too.
Yeah. You talked about the orchestrated component. And one of the instincts I've developed in my work is when I see something in the mainstream sports media, I pay very close attention to who wrote it and the timing of it. And sometimes the release from some of these journalists is simultaneous with the NCAA's release on its website, and the journalist has written a 2,000-word article. So, from a timing standpoint, I think that's kind of a tell. And I've had in my mind a list of about 6 reporters at these major outlets that are the go-to reporters that are kind of in that cozy. I see it as a cozy relationship. I want to specifically exclude, Dan Libet. His work is very much like yours, and I love a lot of what he's done, because some of this stuff transcends college sports, and it goes to the nature of the media, the willingness to really look at stuff that takes some time and effort and elbow grease to dig up, and then to report in a straightforward way. You've done that, and we desperately need more of that. I've talked about it in my other podcast. We're talking about it right now, and I am going to talk about these documents as part of my framing of the imbalance, the power imbalance in the discussion about the future of college sports. And I really appreciate your work. I mean, this is really important work. What's your gut, your instinct tell you about kind of where some of these regulatory issues may land in the next 5 years or so?
It is funny, when you look at the time frame of what is that, right? Is it 5?
Mm-hmm.
Is it 3? Is it 7? Yeah, I don't know, because I do think that this greater NIL industrial complex, the kind of the fascination and the hype and the attention, it's going to fade, right? In part just naturally, because it's still relatively new and there are
Mm-hmm.
so many unknowns. But the second that the courts or the NLRB rule that at least some athletes, some college athletes, are employees,
Mm-hmm.
and conferences or schools, the ones that are now directly or even more directly and in greater amounts paying athletes, they will never lose their NIL rights. But the
Right.
part of NIL that, as I like to say, is kind of Trojan horsed as NIL, but really is just kind of, their roster salary essentially. Does that go away? Does that funding dry up? Does it diminish? So I do think that when this happens in the next, I think 2 to 3 years, right, we'll have some that
Yeah.
it won't be settled, it won't be final, but I do think whether it is, is it Johnson? Is it the NLRB?
Right.
One of those, there's like 3 or 4 horses that which one's going to reach the finish line first. And that's going to change this whole model. And then the employment status, like that's the next big question of, I think not if, but I think it's who, right? Where is that line drawn? What's the
Right.
cutoff? And
Yep.
then how do NIL collectives, are they folded back into the schools or not back, but, are they folded as a different arm or similar to what Texas A&M has done, where it's kind of an independent part of the ecosystem that supports the school? And then it'll become boring is maybe not the right word, but maybe all this kind of becomes boring, right? When it's a biweekly check or direct deposit and it's pretty uniform and it's public and you know who's getting what. And sure, you know what, your Heisman Trophy winner and your Olympic gymnast that went to school after winning gold, like they'll still appear in national brand deals.
Right.
But we'll maybe treat that like when we see Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers
Yep.
on a Sunday afternoon. It's like, okay, yeah, they're super famous and talented and maybe funny or introspective or what have you. Yeah, they deserve a deal with Geico or State Farm or whomever. But I do
Right.
think that the courts will kind of decide that. And then there will be a lot of hand-wringing and commotion. But I think at some point we're going to look up and you hope that there aren't too many maybe Olympic sport athletes that are seriously affected by whatever that big, that meteor hits Earth moment might be. But I do think this will become just kind of settled and all right, like a lot of athletes will get paid more than they are now. The source of the
Right.
funding and the way they're funded might be different, but I think
Right.
life will just kind of go on.
Yeah. The sky won't fall. And I don't think we're going to see the fatal collapse of athletics departments, and the games will go on. The games will go on. So one of the ironies I pointed out is that in the NCAA and Power 5's re-engagement with Congress post-COVID, when the market's back, we're in a historic bull market in college sports revenues and new revenue streams, new technologies. There's some incredible things happening right now, and there's more money than the Power 5 know how to spend. And let's let American principles, free market principles, and economic liberty and egalitarianism, taking your talent and putting it into the market and getting from it whatever the market tells you it's worth. That's what we do in America. But I just want to thank you, Andy, for being willing to talk to us. And I just love your work, and you have impeccable instincts and kind of, what's going on. You know how to crack the nut. And that's so important right now. So it's been a pleasure talking to you, and maybe we'll have you back again as some of these things play out, or you break another bombshell story, or what should be a bombshell story.
Richard, I can't thank you enough. I really enjoyed this conversation. Would be more than happy to come back sometime. So I can't thank you enough.
All right. Take care.